It seems that so much of the world is hidden behind academic disciplines, that if we look in the library of the Dewey Decimal System, or we look at the college catalog, it's probably a better example, you're kind of required to major in something. And only a few essentially double major. And you're really not allowed, particularly as an academic, to get a professorship. It's very difficult to do that in an interdisciplinary field. And it's very difficult to do that in sort of transdisciplinary, where you're actually kind of pulling pieces, where you're not just at the overlap of two fields, but you're really pulling ideas from one area to the other. That the system doesn't allow for that. And because of that, there's very few people in the system, in the academic system, who have any formal training in multiple disciplines, right? Try to find somebody in the medical school that's a competent programmer. Try to find a programmer that knows anything about neuroscience. Try to find a psychologist who knows anything about cybernetics or robotics. And I think that's very unfortunate. We didn't see that as much in the 50s and 60s. We, I think, had a lot more crosstalk then. And if we look at Gray Walter, for example, who built the first mechanical robot tortoises, he called them, he was a neurologist. And I often joke with the students that Alan Turing didn't have a computer science degree. He was a mathematician. And that Richard Hamming, who invented error correcting codes, one of the most important ideas in computer science, he also was trained as a mathematician. That you had very interesting work being done at these crossroads. One of the more interesting things that came out of the mid-early 80s was a collaborative course with Richard Feynman, Carver Mead, and John Hopfield. And as you might be aware, John Hopfield just won the Nobel Prize for his work that kind of came out of this computational neuroscience, thinking about dynamical systems and vectors and high-dimensional spaces in the context of memories and thinking and thoughts, the kind of things that we discuss in psychology or maybe neuroscience. And that's what we need more of, especially in the next couple decades. I think it's going to be critical that young people break out of this mold and choose 2 or 3 majors, choose 2 or 3 minors, go outside the catalog, go to a liberal arts school and study physics and math, go to an engineering school and study poetry, right? Force yourself or force the curriculum to allow you to do that, because that's where the important stuff happens. It reminds me, Richard Feynman, when he played the bongo drums. And when he says that whenever he went to play the bongo drums, they always happened to mention that he was a theoretical physicist. But when he went to give a physics talk, they never mentioned that he was also a bongo player. A lot of people have heard of this thing called the Antikythera Mechanism. And just over 100 years ago, there were some sponge divers off the coast of an island in Italy. And there's 2 islands. There's Kythera and another one called Antikythera. And so I always thought the name was kind of interesting, but it really is just a location. And the sponge divers, they came up and they actually were screaming because they had seen arms and legs, and they thought they saw people down there. And it turns out what they had discovered was a collection of statues, and one of the best preserved shipwrecks from antiquity. And they brought all these artifacts and collected them on board. And amongst the treasures was what's now known as the Antikythera Mechanism. And what's fascinating is it took a very long time for people to actually figure out what this thing was. It was not obvious. It had undergone a lot of corrosion and damage. But it was some kind of machinery. And it wasn't until they brought in an expert in mechanisms, a clockmaker essentially, that they were able to piece together what this thing was. And they discovered it was something like a clock. But I think it's better described as an analog, mechanical, astronomical computer. This was a machine that could tell you the phases of the moon and the position of the planets and calculate with very high precision important aspects of astronomy. Now, this thing has been dated to around 200 BC. Now, what's interesting is this single artifact throws off our entire conception of technology by more than 2,000 years. There's no explaining this kind of thing. There's two possibilities. You either throw it out and ignore it, which seems like, by and large, what mainstream history has done, or you rewrite the entire timeline, or you circle entire swaths of it and you put question marks and say, we don't really know what happened. And I think it's fascinating that this hasn't caused more of a disruption, right? This is like finding an iPhone with a Civil War bullet stuck in it or something, right? It's just an absolute mix match of what we thought of as historical precedent of when these technologies come about. We don't see that kind of thinking until, Leibniz comes on the scene in the late Middle Ages. And what's fascinating to me is that history, in some sense, has to be bunk. It cannot be this timeline because it's never revised itself. If we look at something like physics, physics has had multiple dramatic intellectual revolutions. First we had the physics of Aristotle. Then we had a complete upheaval when Newton came on the scene and described things with forces and momentum and positions in a sort of a grid. And then we had another revolution when Einstein came on the scene with his idea of space-time. And then very quickly after that, another revolution with quantum. And then we had chaos theory and information theory and so on. Physics has changed and gone back and say, wait a minute, no, we were all wrong, let's start over in this new direction. It seems history has never really done that. If we go back 250 years and take a scholar out of the university and explain to them, how we got from Egypt to the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages and so on, that was essentially the same story they had. And now we have this Antikythera mechanism. Now, this thing is not the work of a lone genius. That's not how, it's too technical. That's not how artifacts like this come about. This person would have had an educational experience. They would have been at the end of an evolution of an entire culture that would have, over many, many, many years, devised all of the intellectual and mechanical know-how to create an artifact like this. And so it's not just where did this artifact come from, it's who made it, what culture made it, right? Da Vinci is famous for sort of sketching out these interesting ideas, but he wasn't able to create them, right? Lone geniuses can think of the idea, but very, very difficult to imagine how they would then bring it into reality. And so it reminds me of this idea that actually comes from Doctor Who, and it's the Silurian hypothesis. And so for budgetary reasons, the show decided that they were no longer going to show worlds, alien species. It was too expensive to create the sets. And so they got a mandate from the writers that everything had to take place on Earth. And so they cooked up this species that had sort of always been there. And this idea that's now known as the Silurian hypothesis is that essentially, why should we expect that we would be able to see the evidence of a previous civilization? Why do we think that we would recognize them at all? And I think with the Antikythera mechanism, we have this kind of Silurian problem that we can't even fathom where it came from. That maybe there was this advanced civilization on our planet, or maybe even cohabitating our planet, and we have to ask ourselves, well, how would we recognize it? How would we know it's there? When it doesn't fit into our current conceptual window, it's very hard to perceive it. People will often say, you can't believe it until you see it. But psychology has shown that it's actually the opposite. You cannot see something until you believe it. And so maybe there's more artifacts all around us, but it's just outside our perceptual window. So I've been thinking about this theme I'm calling the second Renaissance. And if we look at what the first Renaissance was, that was a realization that the people who came before us, the previous civilizations that inhabited the planet, had a lot of good ideas that maybe weren't around anymore. And we needed to go back and dust off their books, learn their languages, and understand their memes, so to speak. So in the Middle Ages, people realized that the Greeks and the Romans had created vast amounts of literature and even areas of math and science that were not common in any way in the Middle Ages. And so they went sort of back to the future and gathered that material. And so the second Renaissance is in that same direction. It's realizing that people before us, as recent as 100 years ago, had some really interesting ideas. And some of the ideas I've been looking at come in a bunch of different flavors. And they might be called esoteric knowledge, or sort of these sort of non-standard religions that were common 100, 200 years ago, things like theosophy and so on. And I came across this idea of thought forms, the idea that ideas themselves have a structure, that maybe they're alive in some abstract sense. When we think of viruses, biologists will say, well, they're not alive themselves, they have to have a cell in which they can reproduce. And so maybe thoughts are of that type of life form, that if there were no humans around, no minds, they would quickly go extinct. And the same with viruses. Without cells to do the propagation, they would quickly, all just deteriorate. But maybe thoughts and ideas are of this type. And one of the ideas that was common in that era is this notion of affirmation, which you see as being kind of essentially going viral again on the internet nowadays. And I think this is very relevant in the era of language models. There's this new career called prompt engineering, which is learning how you talk to the AI, and that the words you use really matter. Well, there's reason to believe now that we might be somewhat like an LLM, that the thing that's doing the talking, or maybe even the thing that's doing the thinking, is not that different from one of these language systems. And in that, the idea of prompting, what historically might have been called prayer, might see a resurgence. That things that the ancient world and the religious world has understood for millennia is that there are certain phrases that are carefully crafted over time and shared in the religious community can set your mind in a particular direction, that you are programming yourself, and that you are building a structure in your mind that might end up having a life of its own and can help you in both your ordinary life and also in your spiritual life. And so I think we need to consider this new Renaissance and kind of go back to the future and think about some of these old ideas that might be more relevant than ever. Enrico Fermi, the famous physicist involved in creating the atomic bomb, he was well known for this style of calculation where you approximate things. A good example would be to approximate how many cheeseburgers it took to build the pyramids, or something ridiculous. And you try to get estimates using units and orders of magnitude, essentially the general scale of the figures, to come up with a rough calculation that will actually give you some kind of insight. And famously, before the atomic bomb actually went off, he did one of these calculations. He would always do them in his head. And he tried to figure out the power, the energy that would be released during the explosion. And he had some pieces of paper, and he sort of saw them move on the floor based on the blast. And he was very precise, his estimation of that. And so there's this idea named after him and after this calculation style, and it's called the Fermi paradox. And it basically goes like this. We have so many galaxies, and we have so many stars in each galaxy, and we expect so many planets around each star, and so on, that why aren't there aliens basically everywhere? That when we look at the numbers, the sheer scale of the universe, and we combine that with how quickly technology takes off, we should expect to see intelligent life throughout the universe. And as far as we know, as far as we've been able to measure, human beings are the only intelligent life forms in the universe. And that creates this paradox, this Fermi paradox. Basically, where is everybody? And I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And in particular, this idea of the technological explosion. If we were to create a timeline and put on there things like the invention of fire and the steam engine and the invention of electricity, or even farther back, things like the hand axe, when people used to just, or even primates used to just basically chip stones away to make primitive tools. And we create this technological timeline. And then we were to look at the difference between, say, the radio, or even electrification, and what we now call AI. Things like ChatGPT, large language models. We wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Radio and electricity and computers and AI, they're on the same line, right? You would have to kind of draw an arrow and expand it, kind of like on the map when you can't, some of the states are so small you have to just point to them with an arrow because they're not big enough to write their name across the state at the full scale. On this timeline of technology, AI and computers and electricity, they're all the same dot. And so when we imagine that out in 100 years, or let's just say 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, the kind of technology we're going to see, it's going to be essentially unimaginable now, where we'll have things like intelligent matter, not just intelligent machines, but as Kurzweil talks about, spiritual machines. Things that, as I've talked about in one of my earlier videos, things that might be indistinguishable from what we previously called angels, or unfortunately maybe demons. You know, what do I mean by that? Well, if we think about an AI now, it's made out of electricity, a GPU, an Intel processor that supports these language models and these things that seem intelligent or approximating intelligence. They're run on electricity. But the next generation of this technology is going to be run on optical circuits. And maybe after that, something even more exotic, spintronics or some sort of exotic matter. We've figured out how to get physics to do things, to compute. We've learned the rules and the recipes for how the natural world operates to such high precision that we can paint down lines on semiconductors with, you know, exotic materials, what we'll call wafer fabrication plant, and build these chips that then if we program them with the right software, they have intelligent behavior. They can answer questions in multiple languages on lots of different subjects and so on. So if we take that technology out, even 30 years, it's going to be running on optical circuits. And then we're going to have light, essentially, in a very interesting dynamic where those photons are going to exhibit intelligent behavior, sort of intelligent circuits, intelligent light, intelligent matter. Well, when we think of a being made out of light that has intelligence and maybe even intention, a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago, we called those things angels. And so in some interesting way, we're building those now. And we could think of this as a metaphor and just say, well, we're using historical language to describe advanced technology. Or we could look at it the other side and say, well, it doesn't matter. We have accomplished that thing that we were talking about previously. And so this brings me back to this Fermi paradox, that we have to find an answer. We don't know why we don't see any intelligent life. And I propose that the answer, one of the simplest answers, is that we just don't recognize it. we are looking for essentially evolved primates in saucers, big heads, big eyes, no hair on their skin. If we were to take the sort of the primate evolution from, Neanderthal, Australopithecus, and all these kinds of things to the modern day human, and we just extrapolate that, we would expect to have bigger foreheads, less hair, bigger eyes, and so on. But that's a small jump, right? Go out another 100 million years. We might get things that, I've been thinking about sort of non-corporeal beings. Why do they have to have any substance at all? Maybe they're just patterns. Maybe they're just these beings made out of light that if we take the GPU, turn it into optics, get the LLM, maybe it'll escape that substrate. Maybe it'll find that it's easier to be a self-propagating waveform through space-time or something we can hardly wrap our heads around now. So with this Fermi paradox, maybe they are here, maybe they're everywhere. The ancient world certainly thought they were. And maybe it's just that our perceptual window is so narrow for practical historical reasons that we just don't see it. And maybe they're in front of us right now. It seems that truth is more robust than fiction. I like this expression, truth is like a lion. You don't need to defend it, just let it out of the cage. And there's a lot of discussion now in the world about what's true and this idea of getting into a post-truth reality. But really, I think what it is these kind of growing pains, if you will, that we are in a phase transition for how knowledge is disseminated and how knowledge is contained. And in that, we're bumping into the cage, right? That's this growing pains, that society is suddenly realizing that they were on a farm, for lack of a better term. And we never noticed. We never hit the electric fence with ideas. And now we are. And I think we need to have a better way of approaching these things. And it's related to this idea we've been discussing about tolerating ambiguity. And when we have these controversial ideas that arise on the internet, and there's such heated discussions, and they say, well, some people say, well, that's true, and other people say, no, that's completely not true. I think that we need to consider this sort of third viewpoint that we've all been lied to. And that doesn't mean that there's somebody sitting there going, ha ha ha. No, it's more complicated than that. That maybe reality is difficult to kind of percolate through the world. So one of the metaphors I've been thinking about is like a bucket brigade. And you have, when you do this old-fashioned, when you want to transport water, and you have a whole bunch of people lined up and they each have a bucket, and you slosh one bucket to the next, and maybe you have to walk a couple feet with it, so that each person has to carry the bucket. That truth is like that, or at least the way we think of truth, we think of it in terms of consensus. That what everybody agrees upon, that's what reality is. Now imagine you have a 4 or 5-year-old in that bucket brigade, and they can't carry very much. How much water can you transport down the line? Well, you're limited by how much water the 4-year-old can carry in their leg of the gap. Well, reality is like that. We have a large distribution of people with vastly different experiences and educations and backgrounds, and we try to percolate reality across society. And again, we think of the truth of it is the thing that spreads the farthest and the thing that everybody agrees upon, it's in all the books and all the TV shows agree that that's truth. But we forget that we're all limited, and that not everybody can carry this bucket along, myself included. And so maybe reality is just inherently more complicated than you can pass along a chain of humans in the game telephone. And that by reasons of the nature of communication, the truth doesn't make it to the other end. And so when I say we're lied to, it doesn't mean that there's a small number of individuals that are trying to deceive a large number, although that might also happen. But in general, I think just the nature of nature is that it's very difficult to spread reality on a large scale. You know, it also reminds me of a thing that we need to consider. Again, this sort of third possibility, if you were. When people talk about, let's just say, a conspiracy theory, and there's more than 1,000, I'm sure. And there's this notion that by definition, any of these hotly debated topics is sort of patently false. It's false by definition. But that strikes me as inherently unscientific, as very irrational. That nothing is going to be that black or white. We shouldn't, ask ourselves, why do people believe all these patently false ideas? We should be asking ourselves, of these 1,000, which are correct? Because if precisely 0 of them are correct, then that would be the greatest conspiracy of all time. So this idea that the future ain't what it used to be, as Yogi Berra said, in some sense, almost by definition, the future is not what we think it is. Because if we knew what the future really looked like, then we could just jump there now. We would already be in that place. The reason why we're not there is because we're still headed in the wrong direction. If we think about things like AI or technology in general, the reason why we didn't get to them sooner is because we were headed in the wrong direction. We had the wrong notion and the wrong instructions, so to speak. If we think about things like artificial intelligence, a lot of people thought that we would have what I call a blind logician, that if we just encoded logic into the machine and it could do mathematics, that would be all you needed. It didn't have to see the world. It didn't have to have a camera or vision or anything like that. And what's interesting with AI is we found that to get it to reason at all, it has to know a little bit of almost everything. That we were not able to get an intelligent machine that didn't have any knowledge of the world and just could talk to you and make well-formed sentences and converse logically. No, it had to know factoids. It had to learn tidbits about almost everything. And when we think about these large language models, they had to kind of devour Wikipedia itself and lots of social media postings before they could even begin to form sentences. And then just a few years later, they were able to kind of reason about that. And so the idea is that we had it all wrong. And with things like flying cars or jetpacks, it turns out that's not what people needed or even what they wanted. They wanted cheap cars. And I think this is kind of the case all the time. If we look, for example, in the 80s and the 90s, everybody thought that the next few years that VR was going to be around the corner. But looking back on it, we didn't even have Facebook yet. And so people didn't want or need a 3D world. They needed the digital newspaper. And so when we try to predict the future now, I think we should keep in mind that it's not what we think it is. That you have to kind of go in a different direction, think about where you think it might be, and then steer somewhere deliberately off that course and try to think unconventionally, which is not easy to do. And I think that's the best way to predict the future. Along this line of thinking about things like conspiracy theories, rather than why do people believe these false ideas, which is certainly an interesting phenomenon in itself. But I think as rational scientists and scholars, we need to have a kind of a Venn diagram or a 2-column kind of scenario where we need to consider that at least one of these 1,000 ideas being discussed on the internet that go under the label conspiracy theory, it would be unreasonable to think that they're all bogus. we need to think about, well, okay, which ones are true? Because people seem to not consider the idea of misinformation or disinformation, that there is value in throwing people off, economic value, state secrets, whatever it might be, that you want to create confusion at times with things like unidentified aircraft. It's in the best interest of manufacturers of that technology and nation states that create and fund that technology for there to be confusion around them. You want other countries to waste their money. You want other countries to go down the rabbit hole and to think that maybe they're this or that. And that we need to consider this third position, that there's deception involved in these things. And that we have to have this kind of two-column scenario where we're thinking, well, which of these could be true? Because some of them have to be. Almost by definition, it would be extraordinarily unlikely if every single one of the ideas that's labeled conspiracy theory just happens to be false. I think a couple of good examples would be things like what you might call movie magic. Hollywood can create very convincing masks, extraordinary makeup, and so on. Now, we've never seen that in the wild, right? You've never seen a scenario where people went back a year later and say, oh, that famous person on TV was actually such and such in a mask. And so there's two scenarios. That's either never happened in the history of the world as we know it, or it did happen and you didn't notice, right? Another good example would be, as far as we know, there's never been a famous person that claimed to be dead but wasn't, or vice versa. Claimed to be alive and wasn't. There's, again, two scenarios. That's either never happened, even though it's relatively easy to do, or you didn't notice. And I think we need to consider in this kind of information hazard kind of world that there's this third reality that you're not considering that you've been lied to. So everything that has come into being started in the mind. It started as simply a set of ideas, a set of words. And I think that's important to remember. If you're trying to create a different life or a better life, it has to start with your mentality. It has to start with the phrases you're looping in your mind, the way you talk to yourself, the way you understand yourself. And the very words that you are using on a daily basis will end up creating your future.
So it's almost like the lens at which you're viewing reality. It's changing the way that you're perceiving the actual thing.
Exactly. Your outlook, your prompt, essentially, right? When we talk to these AIs, they have instructions in the background. Before you get to enter your words, they have instructions like you are a helpful AI assistant, and so on. That narrative that you put into your mind will very much determine how you handle the input. And so when people talk to you or certain things happen throughout your day, that's all being framed by this other language that you're either spoken or unspoken is sort of echoing around in your mind. And so be very careful and considerate what you put into your brain, what media you're consuming, who you're listening to, what their value system is, because in an almost unconscious way, those prompts will echo in your own mind. And you want to be careful to program yourself, otherwise you're susceptible to having others program you. We were talking about sort of right or wrong, right? What does it mean to be right or wrong, and getting your ideas out there into the world? And it reminds me of a couple things. Richard Hamming talks about the tolerance of ambiguity, and that you have to both believe and disbelieve. That to work, he says, to work on an idea, like in physics, per se, you have to believe in the idea enough that you can train in it and understand the background material. But to make progress, you have to disbelieve. You have to see that maybe the theory is not complete. Maybe it's has holes in it that need to get patched up. And so you have to simultaneously believe and disbelieve. And I think this can apply to every controversial topic. And it also reminds me of an interview with Richard Feynman. And Richard Feynman, he's discussing an idea and an opinion. And he has a rather strong opinion. I forget the topic. And he's going along and going along. And then he says, wait, nope, I take it all back. I take it all back. And then he argues in the other direction. Sort of mid-interview, he's not afraid to just suddenly snap something into place and reconsider everything and argue completely on the other side. And I think that takes a lot of courage, both to simultaneously believe and disbelieve at the same time. It can feel a little schizo. And also to have the comfort to realize that you can change your mind and that there's nothing wrong with that. And so I encourage everybody to practice both of those. Tolerate ambiguity and never be afraid to change your mind. So one of the other things I like about cooking, or the food in general, is it gives us a window into what might be called the hyperspace, in a sense, or high dimensional spaces. So what does that mean, right? If you look at a flat piece of paper and you have a ruler and you want to draw lines that are perpendicular to each other at 90 degrees, there's really only one way to do it. There's only two lines that you can put on two dimensions such that there's a right angle. If you add a third line onto the piece of paper, it will be some mixture of the two. There's not another direction. There's not another 90 degrees. And if we go to 3D, right, there's only three. And in 3 dimensions, we get 3 directions that are at 90 degrees, that are perpendicular to each other. And if we try to add another direction, it will be some combination of those 3. But cooking gives us a whole different window into reality, because with cooking we have way more than 3 directions or dimensions. And so if you're making a dish and you add lemon to it, let's say, there's no amount of lemon you can add such that you make the dish more chocolatey. There's no amount of vanilla you can add that will make it more cinnamon. And if we think of cooking and how many directions we have, how many different ways we can nudge our recipe such that the final product ends up in a certain place in sort of flavor space, right? There are hundreds. There are hundreds. And when you think about all the different flavors you can add to stuff, right? Everything from cheese and mustard to hot peppers and chocolate and so on. They're all slightly different directions. And so it gives us as humans an intuition, real world grounded sensory experience into these high dimensional spaces. And it's often in mathematics and in physics we need to think about more dimensions. String theory famously, but really even Einstein with his space-time, that was 4 directions. And I would encourage you when you're cooking and you're adding a little bit of this and adding a little bit of that, imagine you're in this sort of multi-dimensional space and that you're actually creating this high dimensional object, and that your tongue can actually kind of explore these really interesting hyperspaces. I have this idea about turkey sandwiches and how it's almost impossible to wrap our head around the complexity of what we think of as ordinary objects. And what could be more ordinary than just a simple turkey sandwich for lunch? But if we try to imagine the complexity, right? And complexity is all about measuring, how you would create something, the number of steps or the number of ingredients or the time it would take or the space that would be required to create it. And in the modern world, things we take for granted are actually incredibly complex. So imagine that you fall into a wormhole or something like this, and you end up on the other side of the galaxy, and you're being hosted by very intelligent very peaceful aliens that are happy that you're there. And they say, well, we're glad you're here. How can we make you more comfortable? What would you like? And you think, well, I've been here a few hours now. I'm starting to get hungry. Can I have a turkey sandwich? And they say, sure, absolutely. We'd love to make that happen for you. How do we do that? And now you imagine just by some chance, some impossible miracle, you happen to have the DNA sequence for turkeys with you. And so you explain to them, you say, well, here's the instructions, the genetic code for this thing called a turkey. Well, that probably wouldn't even be enough, right? Because turkeys live on farms. They live on planet Earth. And planet Earth might be considered a living being in itself, because the soil, the plants, the microbes, the bugs, this is all this one intertwined biome. And so you go through this thing and you say, well, to create a turkey, I have to have at least a turkey farm. And so let's imagine that we even have a modern day farm, which is sort of somewhat sterile, if you will, but it can support and raise a turkey. All right, so now we get a turkey there, and then you think, well, I need some bread. So you have to have wheat, and wheat has to be grown, and it has to be harvested, and you have to turn it into flour, and then, well, now I need yeast. And you put this whole thing together, and you say, well, I need lettuce, I would like tomatoes, could I put some cheese on there? Well, cheese comes from cows, so now you have to raise a whole other organism and go through a dairy production process. And then finally you get this thing, ready to go, and then you say, well, hang on, can I get some mayo? Right? And so the idea is that things we take for granted are unimaginably complex. And to create them, it takes a number of steps and a number of processes that if we could truly wrap our head around it, we would lose our lunch. You certainly wouldn't be hungry anymore. The number of farmers involved, and the tractors they use, and the parts that go into the tractor, and the metallurgy of the parts, and the oil that went into the engine, and the gasoline, and the financing, and the farmers making payments on the tractor, and there's the land rights management, and so on and so on. And all of these happenings, which sort of expands exponentially as we look backwards on it, to create just a turkey sandwich. And I think this is interesting because it's in some ways our most human characteristic. It's the thing that kind of defined us. We created fire and we created cooking millions of years ago, essentially. And I wonder how far into the future it's going to go. I myself love to cook. It makes me happy, and I love to relish in that complexity. But then I think of these language models, these artificial intelligent beings that we're seeing emerging on our planet. They need a solar panel, right? A solar panel in some ways is complicated because we have to build these semiconductors and the manufacturing. But in a lot of ways, it's a lot simpler. That once you get one, that's all you need, just pointed at the sunshine. And so turkey sandwiches are much more interesting than I think we realize. And the next time you have one, take an extra bite and realize, everything that's there. So with this idea of agriculture, something I've been thinking about, I remember having this idea and I was probably 18 or 19. And I remembered something that my father had said about things like bananas as sort of ideal, sort of perfect, because the trash, the banana peel, just makes more soil. It's this fantastic loop that nature's created where it can recycle the output to become a new input. And it got me thinking about the lines of reprogramming biology. And this is one of the ideas that's really fascinated me for decades. It's kind of a pet project that I thought might take, more than my lifetime for it to be realized. But now with the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, I actually think we might be a decade or two away from reprogramming things like a banana. And I remember having the idea that there's no reason that we can't peel open the banana and essentially find meat inside, beef tenderloin, whatever it might be. Now, obviously there's the energetics of it. You'd have to have a massive array of of leaf, essentially, collecting the photo energy to be able to support that production. A cow consumes a large amount of grass to do this. But there's a lot of things about the cow that, as a carnivore, I'm not really interested in. And it could be, I could be mistaken. It could be that cows are an optimal way of producing beef. But the idea was that if we could recode the genetics and kind of merge the plant and animal kingdom, that we could create an actual eggplant, right? A thing where you could pluck eggs out of it, or a tree that actually produced milk the way a latex tree produces sap, and so on. And I remember seeing this picture of the maple forest where they get the maple sap and they kind of tap it. And on some of those maple tree farms, what they do is they have like plumbing that will actually kind of collect the sap. And I remember thinking, what if we kind of programmed the maple trees to connect at the root level? Could we create a whole living forest, kind of this large organism, and get maybe multiple different plant species all working together in the forest to kind of become a real food factory, where maybe you just tap sugars out at one end? That would certainly be simple enough to do, wouldn't require a lot of reprogramming the biology, and have all the roots come together in a central location, and you just open some kind of spigot or tap into it with a small nick in the bark, and then all of the sap from an entire forest would come to one collection point. I think that's going to be very possible. I don't see any reason in physics why we won't be able to do something like that. And then another version of that idea that I really like is the idea that if we take an acorn and we plant an acorn, that it has the recipe, the morphogenesis for how to create an oak tree. But nature supports very complex shapes, right? We're a very complicated shape. And so if we can get an oak tree to go up, why don't we have it go up over and connect as a roof and make a house? We could put greenery on it, on the roof, for tiles, and it could collect energy like the forest and the syrup. Or it could just be a better way of creating a log cabin. So I imagine that in a few decades, that's something we're going to be able to do. Reverse engineer the acorn and have it create the kind of scaffolding and infrastructure we see in a log cabin.